American history is full of presidents nobody remembers, not because they were boring, though some were, but because their stories are uncomfortable, tragic, or just overshadowed by the ones who got monuments and holidays. These are the forgotten presidents, the accidental ones, the ones who joined the Confederacy, died after eating cherries, or reformed the government while dying of a disease they kept secret. Before we begin, if you enjoy falling asleep to obscure history and deadpan commentary, consider subscribing. It helps more than you'd think. So get comfortable, adjust your pillow, and let's talk about the president's history tried to forget. Starting with number 10, the accidental president who used to model for Cosmopolitan. Gerald Ford, the accidental president who just wanted everyone to calm down. So here's the thing about Gerald Ford. He's probably the most accidentally presidential person to ever accidentally become president. And I mean that in the most literal way possible, because Gerald Ford didn't run for president in 1974. He didn't even run for vice president. He was appointed to both jobs like someone filling in for a sick coworker who then also got sick, except the sickness was massive political scandal and constitutional crisis. You know how sometimes in movies there's that person who's just there? Not the hero, not the villain, just a solid, dependable person who shows up and does their job? That was Gerald Ford. He was a congressman from Michigan for 25 years. 25 years. He showed up, he voted, he went home. He wasn't trying to change the world. He was just trying to represent his district and maybe play some golf on the weekends. And then suddenly, in the span of about 8 months, he went from House Minority Leader to Vice President to President of the United States, which is roughly the political equivalent of going from substitute teacher to superintendent because everyone else got food poisoning at the district meeting. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely bizarre. Before Gerald Ford was the steady hand that guided America through the Watergate hangover, before he was pardoning Richard Nixon and telling everyone to just take a breath, he was a male model. Yes, a male model. In 1942, a young Gerald Ford, well, he was Leslie King Jr. back then, but we'll get to that, posed for Look magazine. And then for Cosmopolitan, on the cover, in ski clothes, looking like every mother's dream of what a nice young man should look like. Can you imagine? The same guy who would later trip down the stairs of Air Force One and inspire Chevy Chase's entire career was once considered photogenic enough to sell magazines. He had that wholesome, all-American jaw. He'd been a college football star at Michigan. He turned down offers from the Detroit Lions and Green Bay Packers to go to Yale Law School instead, which is either the smartest or dumbest decision depending on how you feel about concussions versus constitutional law. But let's back up because Gerald Ford's origin story is actually kind of heartbreaking. He wasn't born Gerald Ford. He was born Leslie Lynch King Jr. in Omaha, Nebraska in 1913. His biological father was abusive. His mother fled with baby Leslie when he was just 16 days old. 16 days. She moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan, met a paint salesman named Gerald Rudolph Ford, married him, and they renamed the kid Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr. He didn't find out Gerald Ford wasn't his biological father until he was 17, when his birth father showed up at a restaurant where young Gerald was working and introduced himself. Just showed up. Hey, I'm your real dad, surprise. That's the kind of thing that would send most people to therapy for decades, but Ford just kind of shrugged and kept being earnest and Midwestern about everything. Fast forward to 1973. Richard Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned because of tax evasion and bribery charges. This was before the whole Watergate thing really exploded, mind you, so Nixon needed a new vice president, and he picked Ford specifically because Ford was boring, trustworthy, liked by both parties, the human equivalent of oatmeal, nutritious, dependable, never going to surprise you. Congress confirmed him, and Ford became vice president without a single American voting for him. Then, less than a year later, Nixon resigned. It was August 9th, 1974. Ford took the oath of office in the East Room of the White House and said, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over." Which is maybe the most comforting thing anyone had said in American politics in years. No drama, no grand promises. Just, hey, that was bad, let's move on. Except he couldn't just move on, because a month later he pardoned Richard Nixon. Fully pardoned him for any crimes he might have committed while president, and the country absolutely lost its mind. His approval rating dropped from 71% to 49% basically overnight. People thought there was a secret deal that Nixon had appointed Ford with the understanding that Ford would protect him. There wasn't. Ford just thought the country needed to heal, needed to stop talking about Watergate every single day, needed to move forward. He probably wasn't wrong, but it cost him politically. Some historians think it cost him the 1976 election. Here's what's strange, though. Ford was actually a pretty progressive guy. For a Republican in the 70s. He supported the Equal Rights Amendment. He appointed the first female White House photographer. He continued Nixon's policy of détente with the Soviet Union and China. He survived 2 assassination attempts in the same month, September 1975, both by women, which is statistically weird. First was Lynette Squeaky Fromm, a Charles Manson follower who pointed a Colt 45 at him in Sacramento. The gun didn't fire because she forgot to chamber a round. 17 days later, Sarah Jane Moore actually got a shot off in San Francisco, but a bystander grabbed her arm and the bullet missed. Ford just kept going, kept being steady, kept being the guy who would trip over things and laugh at himself. He once hit a spectator with a golf ball and quipped about it. He wore a win button, whip inflation now, that everyone mocked, but he wore it anyway because he genuinely thought maybe if everyone just tried a little harder to save money, inflation would go down. It didn't work, but you had to appreciate the optimism. And here's the thing about Ford's presidency. Nothing huge happened, and that was kind of the point. After the chaos of Vietnam and Watergate, after the protests and the riots and the constitutional crisis, the country got 2.5 years of a president who was just competent, not inspiring, not terrible. He showed up, did his job, didn't lie to anyone, didn't burn the place down. He lost to Jimmy Carter in 1976, gave a gracious concession speech, and went back to being a private citizen. He lived to be 93, the longest lived president at the time, dying in 2006. So why is Gerald Ford forgotten? Because he was exactly what the country needed in 1974, but not what history remembers. He was the substitute teacher who kept the class from descending into chaos, not the inspiring professor who changed your life. He was the friend who drove you home when you were too drunk to drive yourself, not the friend you tell stories about at parties. He was the president who showed up in the middle of a national disaster, said, "Okay, let's just breathe for a second," and then quietly did his job until someone else took over. No scandals, no triumphs, no major legislative achievements, just steady, dependable, accidental leadership from a guy who used to model ski clothes. And honestly, sometimes that's exactly what you need. Someone who isn't trying to be remembered, just trying to help. Ford never wanted to be president. He wanted to be Speaker of the House, but when his country accidentally needed him, he showed up, did the job, took the criticism, and went home, which is about as American as it gets, really. But of course, dying in office tends to make you memorable for about 5 minutes before everyone forgets you entirely, and our next president knew that better than anyone. Zachary Taylor, the general who died eating cherries while history forgot his name. Zachary Taylor was president for exactly 16 months and 5 days, which in presidential terms is basically a really long lunch break. He died in office after eating cherries and drinking milk at a 4th of July celebration in 1850. And if that sounds ridiculous, well, you're starting to understand why nobody remembers him. But here's the weird part. For a guy who barely had time to unpack his stuff in the White House, he almost started a civil war, stopped a war with Spain, and got himself caught up in poison conspiracy theories that wouldn't be resolved for 140 years. Let me paint you a picture. It's July 4th, 1850. Washington, D.C. is absolutely sweltering, the kind of heat where your shirt sticks to your back and you can feel the air sitting on your skin like a wet towel. They're dedicating the Washington Monument. Well, the beginning of it. The thing won't actually be finished for another 34 years. And President Taylor is there in the blazing sun, listening to speeches, being presidential. He's 65 years old, which in 1850 is ancient. He's been president for exactly 1 year, 4 months, and 5 days. After hours of this, he goes back to the White House and does what any reasonable person would do after standing in the July heat for too long. He absolutely destroys a bowl of cherries and iced milk. Some accounts say he also ate raw vegetables and drank ice water. The point is, he consumed a lot of cold things very quickly while extremely overheated, and his digestive system said absolutely not. Within hours, he was violently ill. Stomach cramps, nausea, the works. His doctors diagnosed him with cholera morbus, which was basically the 19th century's way of saying severe gastroenteritis from something you ate. They treated him the way doctors treated everything in 1850. They bled him, gave him various mercury-based medicines, and probably made everything worse. 5 days later, on July 9th, 1850, Zachary Taylor died. And immediately, people started whispering, poison. Now, you have to understand the context here. Taylor was a Southerner, born in Virginia, raised in Kentucky, owned a plantation in Mississippi with more than 100 enslaved people. Everyone assumed he'd be pro-slavery expansion, but Taylor surprised everyone by opposing the extension of slavery into the territories gained from the Mexican-American War. He told Southern states that if they tried to secede over the issue, he'd personally lead the army against them and hang traitors with as little mercy as he had hanged deserters and spies in Mexico. This is not a man who made idle threats. This is a guy whose nickname was Old Rough and Ready because he'd spent 40 years in the military not caring about appearances or diplomacy. So when he suddenly died just as the Compromise of 1850 was being debated, a massive political deal that would determine whether slavery expanded west, some people thought maybe the pro-slavery forces had helped him along. For 140 years, the rumors simmered. Was it cholera? Was it typhoid? Was it poison? In 1991, a historian named Clara Rising convinced Taylor's descendants to let her exhume his body. They dug up Zachary Taylor, took samples of his hair, fingernails, and bone, and tested them for arsenic. The results came back. No poison. He really did just die from eating cherries and milk in the heat, which is somehow both disappointing and perfectly on brand for a presidency that barely happened. But let's talk about who Zachary Taylor actually was, because he's genuinely fascinating in a, wait, this guy was president kind of way. He was a career military officer who never voted in an election until he was 62 years old. 62. He didn't even vote for himself in 1848. He'd spent his entire adult life in the army, moving from posting to posting, fighting in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, the Second Seminole War, and finally the Mexican-American War, where he became a national hero. The Mexican-American War made him famous. He won battles despite being outnumbered. He sat on his horse, Old Whitey's side saddle, during combat because it was more comfortable. He dressed like a farmer most of the time, wearing a straw hat and dusty clothes, refusing to wear a military uniform unless absolutely necessary. His soldiers loved him because he was gruff and plain spoken and genuinely seemed to care whether they lived or bit, which was not a given with generals in the 1840s. The Whig Party nominated him for president specifically because he was popular and had no political record they could attack. He'd never held political office. He'd never even stated a political opinion publicly. He was a blank slate who happened to win some wars. The campaign was basically vote for the war hero. He has no ideas. And it worked. He moved into the White House in March 1849 with absolutely no political experience and immediately started confusing everyone. He opposed the expansion of slavery despite owning enslaved people himself, which made Southern Democrats furious. He supported California and New Mexico becoming free states immediately, skipping the whole territorial phase where slavery could theoretically expand, which made Southern Democrats even more furious. He met with Southern leaders who threatened secession and basically told them to try it and see what happens. Meanwhile, he appointed his former commanding officer, Jefferson Davis, yes, that Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederacy, as his Secretary of War. Davis lasted about a year before Taylor stopped listening to him because they disagreed on literally everything about slavery and territories. Taylor also almost started a war with Spain over Cuba. There was a whole thing with American adventurers trying to invade Cuba to liberate it, and Spain was threatening to retaliate, and Taylor had to issue proclamations telling Americans to stop trying to invade foreign countries in their spare time. And then he ate some cherries. His death completely changed American history. Vice President Millard Fillmore became president and immediately supported the Compromise of 1850, which Taylor had opposed. The compromise delayed the Civil War by 11 years, but ultimately satisfied no one. If Taylor had lived, would he have actually led troops against seceding states in 1850? Would the Civil War have started a decade early? We'll never know because fruit killed him. His body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, and thousands of people filed past to pay respects to a president most of them barely knew. He was buried in Louisville, Kentucky. His horse, Old Whitey, walked behind the funeral procession and reportedly grazed on the White House lawn for months afterward, which is both sad and weirdly touching. So why is Zachary Taylor forgotten? Because 16 months isn't enough time to do anything memorable except die in a memorable way. He didn't have a doctrine or a major law or a defining crisis he overcame. He was a general who became president who died before anyone figured out what kind of president he'd actually be. He was a slaveholder who opposed slavery expansion. He was a Southerner who threatened to hang Southern secessionists. He was a career military man who didn't vote. He was a walking contradiction who ate himself to death at a monument dedication. History remembers the presidents who did things, and Taylor's main accomplishment was dying, right when history was about to get really interesting. He was the preview that got cut off before the main feature, the opening act that never made it to the second song, and all because he couldn't resist cherries on a hot day, which honestly feels like the kind of mundane tragedy that defines way more of history than we'd like to admit. But if you think dying after 16 months makes you forgettable, wait until you hear about the guy who invented okay and still lost re-election. Martin Van Buren, the man who invented okay and got absolutely wrecked by a log cabin. Martin Van Buren has the distinct honor of being the first president born as a United States citizen, which you'd think would give him some kind of special status in the history books. But instead, he's mostly remembered, if he's remembered at all, for an economic depression that wasn't really his fault, and for losing re-election to a guy whose entire campaign was based on a lie about living in a log cabin. Oh, and he might have accidentally invented the word okay, which is quite possibly his greatest contribution to human civilization, and even that's disputed. Let me set the scene. Van Buren was born in Kinderhook, New York in 1782, which made him the first president born after the Declaration of Independence. Everyone before him, Washington through William Henry Harrison, was born a British subject. Van Buren was American from day one, born in a country that was 6 years old and still figuring out what that even meant. His parents ran a tavern, and young Martin grew up speaking Dutch as his first language, making him the only president whose first language wasn't English, which is a genuinely interesting fact that approximately nobody knows. He became a lawyer, then a politician, then a master political operator, and I mean master. This guy was so good at politics that his enemies called him the little magician and the red fox of Kinderhook because he was short, had reddish hair, and was extremely good at making political problems disappear and reappear wherever he wanted them. He helped build the modern Democratic Party. He was Andrew Jackson's vice president, and then Jackson basically handed him the presidency in 1836, like passing a torch, except the torch was already on fire, and the fire was the American economy. Van Buren took office in March 1837. 2 months later, the Panic of 1837 hit, and it hit hard. Banks collapsed. Businesses failed. Unemployment skyrocketed. Cotton prices crashed. It was the worst economic crisis the country had seen, and it lasted for years. And here's the thing. It wasn't Van Buren's fault. The seeds were planted during Jackson's administration. Wildcat banking, land speculation, Jackson's war on the Second Bank of the United States, international financial issues. But Van Buren was president when it all exploded, so he got blamed. His response was to propose the independent treasury system, which would separate federal funds from private banks. It was actually a reasonable idea that eventually became policy, but it didn't fix the immediate crisis, and people needed someone to blame. Van Buren became that someone. He was portrayed as an out-of-touch aristocrat who wore fancy clothes and ate with gold spoons while regular Americans suffered, which was somewhat unfair but also not entirely inaccurate. The man did enjoy his silk vests. But let's talk about OK, because this is where it gets weird. There are competing theories about the origin of OK, but one of the most credible involves Van Buren's nickname, Old Kinderhook, after his hometown. In the 1840 election, Van Buren supporters formed Democratic clubs called OK Clubs, Old Kinderhook Clubs. They'd use OK as a slogan, a rallying cry, a stamp of approval. It's OK, meaning it's Old Kinderhook, meaning vote for Van Buren. Now, there was already some slang use of OK floating around as an abbreviation for all correct, a jokey misspelling of all correct that was part of a brief fad for humorous abbreviations in late 1830s newspapers. But the Van Buren campaign popularized it, spread it, made it part of political discourse. The opposition even used it against him, claiming OK stood for out of cash or often contradicts. And then somehow OK just stayed. It embedded itself in the English language and eventually in languages around the world. It became maybe the most universally recognized and used American contribution to global vocabulary. So Martin Van Buren might have accidentally given the world OK, and nobody remembers this because he lost re-election in one of the most brutal political campaigns in American history. Enter William Henry Harrison, Van Buren's opponent in 1840. Harrison was a former general, a war hero, genuinely accomplished, but he was also from a wealthy Virginia family. He didn't live in a log cabin, he lived in a mansion, but when a newspaper sarcastically suggested Harrison would be happy to just sit in a log cabin drinking hard cider instead of running for president, his campaign managers had the greatest idea in the history of terrible political ideas. Lean into it. They made Harrison's entire campaign about log cabins and hard cider. They built log cabin replicas at rallies. They served hard cider. They portrayed Harrison as a simple man of the people, even though he absolutely wasn't. And they portrayed Van Buren as an effete, out-of-touch aristocrat who used cologne and ate fancy food with French silverware. The Whig campaign created a song that went, "Let Van from his coolers of silver drink wine, and lounge on his cushioned settee. Our man on a Buckeye bench can recline, content with hard cider is he." It's the 1840 version of attack ads, except catchier and more devastating. Van Buren's campaign tried to fight back with facts, his record, his policies, his actual positions. But facts are boring when your opponent is literally rolling a giant ball covered in slogans across the country and serving free alcohol to voters. Yes, they did that. The Harrison campaign rolled a giant paper ball from city to city, picking up more slogans and supporters as it went. It's where "keep the ball rolling" comes from. Van Buren lost in a landslide. He won only 7 states. The little magician had been outmagicked by a log cabin that didn't exist, and hard cider he'd probably never touched. Harrison became president and died 31 days later, but that's a different story. Van Buren tried to run again in 1844, but lost the Democratic nomination to James Polk. He tried one more time in 1848 as a third-party candidate with the Free Soil Party, running on an anti-slavery expansion platform, which was genuinely principled but politically doomed. He lost again. He retired to Kinderhook, to Lindenwold, his estate, where he lived until 1862. He died of heart failure, having lived long enough to see the Civil War start and to know that his political legacy was basically that guy between Jackson and the Whigs who happened to be president during a depression. And that's the tragedy of Martin Van Buren. He was genuinely skilled, one of the best political operators of his era. He helped create the modern party system. He navigated incredibly complex political situations. He took principled stances later in life against slavery expansion when it would have been easier to stay quiet. He might have given us okay, which we say approximately 10,000 times a day. But he was president during an economic catastrophe that wasn't his fault. He got beaten by a fake log cabin, and history mostly shrugged and moved on. He's sandwiched between Andrew Jackson, who's on the $20 bill despite absolutely not deserving it, and William Henry Harrison, who's remembered for dying quickly. Van Buren is just there. The first American-born president, forgotten by the Americans who came after. He was okay, which, given what we know now, might actually be the most appropriate epitaph possible. James Buchanan, the bachelor president who watched America burn and did absolutely nothing about it. James Buchanan has the unfortunate distinction of being consistently ranked as the worst president in American history, which is really saying something when you consider the competition. But here's the thing. He didn't stumble into this position through incompetence or scandal or some dramatic failure. No, Buchanan earned his spot at the bottom through something far more damning. He saw the country falling apart, understood exactly what was happening, and decided to just let it happen. He sat in the White House, wrung his hands, cited constitutional technicalities, and watched as the United States of America tore itself in half. And through it all, he maintained the careful, deliberate manner of a man who'd spent his entire life being diplomatic, which turned out to be exactly the wrong skill set for 1860. But before we get to the part where he becomes history's most spectacular example of presidential failure, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the absence of an elephant. James Buchanan was the only president who never married, and he remains the only bachelor president in American history. He lived to be 77 years old, held every significant political office except vice president, and never once had a wife. In the 1800s, this was unusual enough to generate whispers. The whispers got louder when you considered his relationship with William Rufus King. King was a senator from Alabama, later vice president under Franklin Pierce, and for 15 years, he and Buchanan shared living quarters in Washington, D.C. They were inseparable. They attended social functions together. They were referred to by their political peers as Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy, and Buchanan and his wife. Andrew Jackson called King Miss Nancy. Aaron V. Brown, a fellow politician, wrote letters referring to their relationship in terms that were, shall we say, pointed. When King went to France as minister, Buchanan wrote him letters that were remarkably affectionate, even by 19th century standards, when male friendship was more openly emotional. Were they a couple? History doesn't have a smoking gun, and people in the 1850s weren't exactly documenting same-sex relationships in notarized affidavits. But the circumstantial evidence is substantial enough that historians have been politely debating this for decades. What we know for certain is that Buchanan had been engaged once, in his 20s, to a woman named Anne Coleman. She broke off the engagement after rumors that he was only interested in her father's money. She died shortly after, possibly by suicide, possibly from an overdose of laudanum. Buchanan never courted anyone seriously again and requested that he be buried with the letters she'd written him. He kept his private life extremely private after that, which in Washington, D.C. is like trying to keep a secret in a room full of people whose job is finding out secrets. So, Buchanan entered the White House in 1857 as a lifelong bachelor, which made him unusual but not disqualified. What disqualified him for the history books was what he did, or rather didn't do, about slavery and secession. He'd been minister to Great Britain during the Bleeding Kansas Crisis and the most explosive years of the 1850s, which meant he'd successfully avoided having to take any public stance on the most divisive issue in American politics. This made him the perfect compromise candidate for Democrats in 1856. He won the presidency by being the guy who had been conveniently out of the country when everyone else was choosing sides. His presidency began with the Dred Scott decision, which the Supreme Court announced 2 days after his inauguration. The decision declared that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. Buchanan had known about the decision in advance. He'd actually corresponded with Justice Robert Greer to influence the ruling. He supported the decision publicly, believing it would settle the slavery question once and for all. It did not settle the slavery question. It made everything exponentially worse. Here's where Buchanan's personal life intersects with his politics in a weird way. He owned no enslaved people himself. In fact, he had a habit of purchasing enslaved people in Washington, D.C., specifically to free them, which sounds noble until you realize he was literally buying human beings to ease his own conscience while simultaneously supporting the legal framework that kept millions in bondage. He'd buy them, manumit them, and then feel good about himself while voting for pro-slavery policies and defending the institution as constitutional and necessary. As president, he packed his cabinet with Southerners and Southern sympathizers. His Attorney General, Jeremiah Black, was from Pennsylvania but sided with the South on nearly everything. His Treasury Secretary stole government funds to support Southern states. His administration was essentially captured by pro-slavery interests, and Buchanan either didn't notice or didn't care. Then came John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. Brown, the abolitionist who had already made a name for himself in Kansas, tried to start a slave rebellion by seizing the federal arsenal. Buchanan's response was swift: send in federal troops, capture Brown, ensure he was tried and executed. Buchanan handled the immediate crisis efficiently, but he completely failed to understand what it represented. The fact that the country was so polarized that people were now attempting armed insurrection. The 1860 election broke the Democratic Party in half. Southern Democrats walked out of the convention and nominated their own candidate. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas. The Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln. Buchanan sat in the White House and watched his party destroy itself, offering no leadership, no direction, no attempt to bridge the gap. Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state. And then the South started seceding. South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed in January and February of 1861. And Buchanan's response was to give a speech to Congress, essentially saying, secession is illegal, but I can't do anything about it because the Constitution doesn't give me the power to coerce states. So I guess we're stuck. He argued that states had no right to secede, but also that the federal government had no right to stop Sabem. It was the political equivalent of saying that's bad and someone should do something, while being the only person with the authority to do something. His cabinet was falling apart. Southern members were resigning to join the Confederacy. His treasury was empty. Federal forts in southern states were being surrounded and cut off, and Buchanan just kept insisting that the problem was too complicated for him to solve, that it would have to be Lincoln's problem. There was one brief moment where Buchanan showed something resembling a spine. In January 1861, he sent a ship called the Star of the West to resupply Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Confederate forces fired on it, and it turned back. This was, technically, the first shots of the Civil War, but nobody talks about it because Buchanan didn't follow up with anything. He just sent one ship, it got shot at, it left, and that was it. He counted down the days until Lincoln's inauguration like a student waiting for summer vacation. He reportedly told Lincoln, "If you are as happy entering the White House as I am leaving it, then you are a very happy man indeed." Then he went back to Pennsylvania and lived another 7 years, writing a book defending his presidency that convinced approximately no one. But here's the really damning thing. Buchanan wasn't stupid. He wasn't incompetent in the traditional sense. He'd been Secretary of State, a senator, a minister to Russia and Great Britain. He understood politics and diplomacy. He just fundamentally believed that the Constitution didn't allow him to act decisively, and he valued constitutional procedure over preserving the Union. He thought if he just didn't do anything provocative, cooler heads would prevail and the crisis would resolve itself. He was a diplomat in a moment that required a leader, a lawyer in a moment that required a warrior, a compromiser in a moment when compromise was no longer possible. His personal life remained private until the end. His niece, Harriet Lane, served as his first lady and was apparently quite popular in Washington society. He died in 1868, having lived long enough to see the Civil War end and knowing that history would blame him for failing to prevent it. He was buried in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and his tombstone doesn't mention that he was president. It lists his other accomplishments, senator, minister, secretary of state, and skips right over the big one. So why is James Buchanan forgotten? Because being remembered as the worst president in history isn't the same as being remembered fondly, and most people would rather just forget the whole thing. He's the president who proved that doing nothing can be worse than doing the wrong thing. He's the bachelor who maybe loved a man in an era when that was unspeakable, and who bought slaves to free them while supporting slavery, and who watched the United States collapse and decided the Constitution prevented him from stopping it. He's forgotten because remembering him is uncomfortable. He's the reminder that good intentions, experience, and intelligence mean nothing if you don't have the courage to act when action is required. And in a way, being forgotten is the kindest thing history could do to him, because the alternative is being remembered as the man who let America burn. But if you think inaction in the face of catastrophe is bad, wait until you hear about the guy who was so busy having affairs and playing poker that he barely noticed his administration was drowning in corruption. Warren G. Harding, the president who lost White House china in a poker game and died before the scandals caught up Warren G. Harding, is what happens when you take a genial, good-looking guy who's really good at giving speeches and making friends, give him absolutely no business being president, and then surround him with the kind of people who view public office as a personal ATM machine. He wanted to be liked. He wanted everyone to have a good time. He wanted normalcy. That was his campaign slogan, which he invented by accidentally saying normalcy instead of normality and just running with it. What he got instead was an administration so corrupt that historians are still finding new scandals, a series of extramarital affairs so numerous they require spreadsheets, and a death so sudden and mysterious that conspiracy theories still bubble up occasionally like swamp gas. But let's start with the poker, because the poker is important for understanding who Warren Harding was. The man loved poker. Loved it. He played twice a week in the White House, hosting games that went late into the night. Cabinet members, senators, friends, whoever was around. And here's the thing. Harding wasn't particularly good at poker. He lost regularly. And sometimes when he ran out of cash, he'd bet other things, like, say, White House china. Yes, the President of the United States lost pieces of official White House china in poker games, multiple times. This is not an urban legend. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, and Washington, D.C.'s most vicious gossip confirmed it. She attended some of these games. She watched the President of the United States bet government property on a pair of eights. The White House staff eventually had to start hiding the good china so Harding couldn't gamble it away to senators. This should tell you something about Harding's judgment, or rather, his lack thereof. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't trying to destroy the presidency. He was just a guy who got in way over his head and tried to make the best of it by being friendly and hoping everything would work out. Spoiler, it did not work out. Harding was born in 1865 in Ohio, which in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was basically the factory that produced presidents. He became a newspaper publisher in Marion, Ohio, married a woman named Florence Kling, who was 5 years older and significantly more ambitious than he was. Florence, nicknamed the Duchess, essentially managed his career, pushed him into politics, and ran his campaigns while he smiled and shook hands and gave speeches that sounded good but didn't really say anything specific. He became a senator, and he was fine at it. Not great, not terrible. He showed up, voted the party line, made friends. He was handsome in that vaguely presidential way, tall, white-haired, deep voice. He looked like he should be president, which in 1920 turned out to be more important than actually being qualified for the job. The Republican convention of 1920 was deadlocked. The party bosses couldn't agree on anyone, so they met in a literal smoke-filled room 404 of the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago, and decided on Harding because he was agreeable and pliable and wouldn't cause problems. He'd do what they wanted. He'd be a team player. One of the men in that room allegedly asked Harding if there was anything in his past that would embarrass the party. Harding asked for 10 minutes alone to think about it. He came back and said no, nothing to worry about. This was a lie of absolutely spectacular proportions, but we'll get to that. Harding won in a landslide against James Cox, promising a return to normalcy after World War I and the chaos of the Wilson years. Americans were exhausted. They wanted someone calm and reassuring. Harding seemed calm and reassuring. He wasn't, but he seemed like it, and that was enough. He took office in March 1921 and immediately started appointing his friends to government positions, a practice that would later be called the Ohio Gang. Some of these appointments were fine. Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State, Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce, Andrew Mellon as Treasury Secretary. These were competent people, but then there was Albert Fall as Secretary of the Interior, Harry Daugherty as Attorney General, and Charles Forbes running the Veterans Bureau, and these guys viewed government service as an opportunity for personal enrichment. The Teapot Dome scandal was the big one. Albert Fall leased Navy oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California. to private companies in exchange for bribes, about $400,000 total, which in early 1920s money is roughly $6 million today. He became the first cabinet member in American history to go to prison. But the corruption went deeper. Forbes stole millions from the Veterans Bureau, awarding contracts to friends and skimming money meant for veterans' hospitals. Dougherty's Justice Department was selling pardons and liquor permits during Prohibition. And Harding was playing poker and having affairs. Let's talk about the affairs because they're genuinely impressive in their scope and recklessness. There was Carrie Fulton Phillips, the wife of a friend, with whom Harding had a 15-year affair that included extremely explicit love letters that read like bad romance novels. The Republican Party literally paid her and her husband to take a trip to Asia during the 1920 campaign to keep her quiet. Then there was Nan Britton, 31 years younger than Harding. They started their affair when she was 20 and he was a senator. She later claimed they had a child together, a daughter born in 1919. Harding never publicly acknowledged the child. Britton wrote a tell-all book in 1927 called The President's Daughter. The Harding family denied everything for decades until 2015 when DNA testing proved that yes, Harding had a daughter with Nan Britton. The child was real. The affair was real. The man was having sex with his mistress in a White House coat closet while being president. Florence Harding knew about at least some of this. After Warren died, she spent days burning his papers and correspondence, destroying as much evidence as possible. She wouldn't even let the doctors perform an autopsy, which led to decades of speculation about whether Warren was poisoned, had a heart attack, had a stroke, or died of something else entirely. Here's what we know about Harding's death. In June 1923, he embarked on a cross-country Voyage of Understanding tour to connect with Americans. By late July, he was in Seattle and became seriously ill. Food poisoning, maybe, or a cardiac episode. He seemed to recover, then relapsed. On August 2nd, in San Francisco, he died suddenly in his hotel room. The official cause was listed as a stroke or heart attack. He was 57. Florence refused an autopsy. She insisted on immediate embalming. She destroyed papers. And people started wondering, did she poison him? Was it stress from the approaching scandals? Was it his doctor's treatments? They'd been giving him purgatives and stimulants that probably made everything worse. We'll never know for certain, but the most likely explanation is cardiac issues, possibly a heart attack or stroke, exacerbated by stress and the medical practices of the 1920s. Harding died before most of the scandals broke publicly. He knew some of it was coming. He'd said to a journalist, "I am not worried about my enemies. It is my friends who are keeping me awake at night." But he died before Teapot Dome went public, before the full extent of the Veterans Bureau scandal emerged, before everything collapsed. Calvin Coolidge became president and essentially pretended Harding had never existed. The Republican Party wanted to move on. America wanted to move on. Florence Harding died the next year, taking whatever secrets she had to the grave. So why is Warren G. Harding forgotten? Because he was handsome and friendly and completely out of his depth, and his main legacy is corruption and affairs and poker games. He's not forgotten because he was evil. He wasn't. He's forgotten because he was weak, and weakness in a president is somehow more shameful than malice. He wanted to be liked, wanted everyone to have a good time, wanted to believe his friends were as loyal as he was. They weren't. They robbed the country blind while he played cards and slept with women who weren't his wife. His memorial in Marion, Ohio is beautiful, a circular marble monument surrounded by columns. Hardly anyone visits. He's a punchline in history textbooks, a cautionary tale about cronyism and corruption. And the really tragic thing is that buried underneath all the scandal was a guy who genuinely wanted to do right, who just didn't have the strength or wisdom or support system to pull it off. He once said, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." He was right, but at least he had the self-awareness to know it, which is more than you can say for some presidents. But speaking of presidents who knew they weren't fit for office, our next guy actually refused to run for re-election because he was so done with politics that he literally vowed never to participate again. Rutherford B. Hayes, the president nobody voted for who banned alcohol and installed the first White House telephone, Rutherford B. Nitsam. Hayes has the unique distinction of losing the popular vote, probably losing the electoral vote, becoming president anyway through a backroom deal that ended Reconstruction and abandoned Black Americans in the South for generations, and then being so thoroughly exhausted by the whole experience that he refused to run for re-election and vowed to never participate in politics again. He's like the embodiment of, I didn't want this job, I didn't win this job fairly, I did the job anyway, and now I'm going to go home and never speak of it again. But before we get to the most controversial election in American history until the year 2000, let's talk about what made Hayes interesting, because there's actually more to him than just the guy who maybe stole the presidency. He was the first president to have a telephone in the White House. He was married to Lemonade Lucy, who banned alcohol from the White House so thoroughly that foreign diplomats complained. He sent federal troops to break railroad strikes, but also pushed for civil service reform. He was a walking contradiction who seemed perpetually uncomfortable with his own power. The election of 1876 was an absolute mess. Hayes was the Republican governor of Ohio. Of course, he was from Ohio, they all were, running against Democrat Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York. The campaign was vicious. Republicans waved the bloody shirt, reminding voters that Democrats had supported the Confederacy. Democrats accused Republicans of corruption and pointed to the Grant administration's scandals. Everyone was terrible to everyone. When the votes were counted, Tilden won the popular vote by more than 250,000 votes. He had 184 electoral votes. He needed 185 to win. Hayes had 165. There were 20 disputed electoral votes from South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, and one from Oregon. Both parties claimed victory in these states. Both parties submitted competing electoral vote certificates. The country was in constitutional crisis. Congress created a special electoral commission, 15 members, 8 Republicans, and 7 Democrats, to decide which votes to count. Shocking absolutely no one, the commission voted along party lines, 8 to 7, to give all 20 disputed votes to Hayes. Hayes won the Electoral College, 185 to 184. He lost the popular vote but became president. But here's where it gets really dark. Southern Democrats agreed to accept Hayes's victory in exchange for what became known as the Compromise of 1877. Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, ending Reconstruction. Without federal protection, Southern states immediately began implementing Jim Crow laws, disenfranchising Black voters, and establishing the system of racial apartheid that would last for the next 90 years. Hayes didn't invent this deal, but he honored it. He pulled the troops, he ended federal intervention, and millions of African Americans who'd briefly experienced citizenship and voting rights were abandoned to state governments that viewed them as less than human. Hayes believed, or claimed to believe, that Southern states would protect Black citizens' rights voluntarily once federal troops left. This was, to be extremely generous, naive. To be less generous, it was a deliberate betrayal in exchange for political power. So Hayes took office in March 1877, with about half the country believing he'd stolen the presidency, and he immediately set about being the kind of president nobody expected. He pushed for civil service reform, trying to end the spoils system where government jobs went to political supporters, regardless of qualification. He fought with his own party over this. Roscoe Conkling, a powerful Republican senator, who controlled New York's patronage machine, became Hayes's bitter enemy. Hayes actually managed to get Chester Arthur, future president, removed from his position as collector of the New York Custom House for corruption. This made him extremely unpopular with the party bosses who had helped put him in office. In 1877, railroad workers across the country went on strike. It was the first major railroad strike in American history. Workers protesting wage cuts during the Depression that followed the Panic of 1873. The strikes turned violent, buildings burned, people died, and Hayes sent in federal troops to break the strikes and restore order. The same federal troops he'd withdrawn from the South, abandoning black Americans, he sent to protect railroad property and break working class protests. The irony was not lost on anyone at the time. Meanwhile, his wife Lucy was revolutionizing White House social life by removing all alcohol. Lucy Hayes was a devout Methodist and temperance advocate. She banned wine, beer, and liquor from all White House functions. Foreign diplomats were horrified. Washington society mocked her as Lemonade Lucy, but she held firm, serving cold water, coffee, and punch at state dinners, while everyone else in Washington got drunk at their own parties and then came to the White House to soberly shake hands. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated, that Hayes's staff eventually started spiking the punch with rum to keep guests from complaining. Whether this actually happened is disputed, but the fact that it's believable tells you something about how unpopular the alcohol ban was. And then there was the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell demonstrated his new invention at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. By 1877, Bell visited the White House and set up a telephone line. Hayes became the first president to use a telephone, though he reportedly found it more novelty than necessity. The first phone number for the White House was 1, just the number 1. That was the whole number. Hayes would pick up this wooden box and talk into it and hear a tinny voice come back, and he was apparently delighted by the whole thing, even though he had almost no one to call. Hayes served one term and refused to run for re-election, keeping a promise he'd made during the campaign. On his last day in office, he wrote in his diary that he was leaving a better man than when I came. He returned to Ohio, to his estate called Spiegel Grove, and spent the rest of his life doing philanthropic work, promoting education and prison reform, and absolutely refusing to participate in politics. When people asked him about running for office again, he'd remind them of his vow. He'd made a promise to serve one term, and he kept it. He attended veterans' reunions. He'd been a Union officer during the Civil War, wounded 5 times, which was genuinely honorable service. He worked with historical societies. He died in 1893 of heart disease, having spent his final years as far from politics as possible. So why is Rutherford B. Hayes forgotten? Because he didn't want to be remembered. He came to power through a questionable process, made a deal that abandoned millions of people to oppression, tried to reform government and failed to make lasting change, served one term, and went home. He was the president who answered the phone when almost nobody else had phones, who banned alcohol while the country wanted to drink, who won an election he probably lost, and who seemed relieved when it was all over. He's the transition president between Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, the gap between the promises of the Civil War and the realities of industrial America. He's forgotten because he was forgettable, despite doing some things that should be remembered, both good and terrible. And maybe that's what he wanted all along, to do the job, make it through, and then disappear into a quieter life where nobody expected anything from him except to show up at reunions and talk about the old days. He kept his promise about not running again, which in presidential politics is almost unheard of. And for that alone, maybe he deserves to be remembered, even if he'd probably prefer we just left him alone in Ohio with his telephone and his lemonade. But if you think banning alcohol from the White House is controversial, wait until you hear about the next guy on Tyler. The accidental president. whose grandchildren are still alive, and who died a Confederate traitor. John Tyler has one of the strangest legacies in American history, and most people don't even know who he is. He was called His Excellency because he was the first vice president to assume the presidency after the death of a sitting president, and half of Washington thought he shouldn't actually be president at all, just acting president, keeping the seat warm until they could figure out what to do. He told them all to go to hell and claimed the full powers of the office. He had 15 children across 2 marriages. He fathered his last child when he was 70 years old. His grandson, not great-grandson, grandson, was still alive in 2025, which means there are only 2 generations between a president born in 1790 and people alive today, which should break your brain a little bit. Oh, and he died a traitor to the United States, having joined the Confederacy and been elected to the Confederate Congress, which is quite possibly the worst ending to a presidential career imaginable. Let's start with how he became president, because it sets the tone for everything that follows. William Henry Harrison won the election of 1840 with that ridiculous log cabin campaign we talked about earlier. Tyler was his running mate, chosen to balance the ticket. Harrison was from Ohio, Tyler from Virginia. Harrison was a war hero, Tyler was a states' rights ideologue. They won in a landslide. Harrison gave the longest inaugural address in history, standing in the cold rain for 2 hours without a coat. He caught pneumonia. 31 days later, he was dead. Nobody had ever dealt with this before. The Constitution said the vice president would assume the powers and duties of the office if the president died, but it didn't clearly state whether the VP actually became president or just acted as president temporarily. Most of the cabinet assumed Tyler would be a placeholder, that major decisions would be made collectively. Tyler showed up and essentially said, "I'm the president now, full stop, deal with it." He took the full oath of office, even though he'd already taken the vice presidential oath, and moved into the White House. He established the precedent that would hold for the next 126 years until it was formalized in the 25th Amendment. But having the title didn't mean anyone respected him. The Whig Party, which had elected him, hated him almost immediately. Tyler was a states' rights Democrat who joined the Whigs only because he despised Andrew Jackson. The Whigs wanted a national bank, protective tariffs, and internal improvements, basically federal power to develop the economy. Tyler vetoed their bank bills. He vetoed their tariff increases. He vetoed so much that his entire cabinet, except for Secretary of State Daniel Webster, resigned in protest. The Whigs formally expelled him from the party. He became a president without a party, leading an administration that couldn't get anything done because Congress wouldn't work with him, and yet somehow he managed to accomplish a few significant things. He signed the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which settled border disputes with Britain and Canada. He ended the Second Seminole War, though ended is generous. It was more like gave up trying to remove all the Seminoles from Florida. And most significantly, he pushed for the annexation of Texas. Texas had been an independent republic since 1836, and the question of whether to annex it had been festering for years because everyone knew it would come in as a slave state and upset the balance between free and slave states. Tyler made it his mission to bring Texas into the Union. He negotiated an annexation treaty. The Senate rejected it, so he waited until after the election of 1844, claimed it was the will of the people because the winner, James Polk, supported annexation and pushed through a joint resolution of Congress instead of a treaty. It only required a simple majority instead of a 2/3 vote. Texas was annexed 3 days before Tyler left office, and it directly contributed to the Mexican-American War that followed. But let's talk about Tyler's personal life, because it's genuinely wild. His first wife, Letitia, was partially paralyzed by a stroke and rarely appeared in public. She died in 1842 while Tyler was president, the first lady to die in the White House. Tyler mourned for about 5 minutes and then started courting Julia Gardner, who was 30 years younger than him. 30 years. She was 24. He was 54. They met at a White House reception. He proposed multiple times before she finally agreed to marry him in 1844, 8 months before he left office. Julia became First Lady for the last 8 months of Tyler's presidency and apparently loved every minute of it. She held elaborate parties, restored some dignity to a presidency that had been mostly defined by political hostility, and then moved back to Virginia with Tyler when his term ended. And then she proceeded to have 7 children with him. 7. He already had 8 children from his first marriage. His last child, Pearl, was born in 1860 when Tyler was 70 years old. This is where the math gets really strange. Tyler had children late in life. Those children also had children late in life. His son, Lyon Gardner. Tyler had 6 children, the last 2. Lyon Gardner, Tyler Jr., and Harrison Ruffin Tyler, born when Lyon was in his 70s in the 1920s. Harrison Tyler was born in 1928. As of 2025, Harrison Tyler is still alive. There are people walking around today whose grandfather was president in the 1840s. The distance between the early American Republic and now is 2 lifetimes. It's absolutely absurd and completely true. After leaving the presidency, Tyler retired to his Virginia plantation, which he named Sherwood Forest because he considered himself a political outlaw. He owned about 70 enslaved people and spent the 1850s becoming increasingly radicalized about slavery and states' rights. When the Civil War started in 1861, Tyler initially tried to broker peace at a conference in Washington. When that failed, he went all in for the Confederacy. He was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives. He never served. He died before the Confederate Congress actually met. He died in January 1862 in Richmond, Virginia, at age 71. The Confederacy gave him a state funeral. The United States government did not acknowledge his death. No flags were lowered in Washington. No official mourning was declared. John Tyler remains the only president who died as an enemy of the United States. His coffin was draped in the Confederate flag. He was buried in Richmond. Years later, after the war, a headstone was placed that identified him as a president of the United States. But the damage to his legacy was permanent. He'd betrayed his oath of office, betrayed the Constitution he'd sworn to uphold, and died supporting a government whose sole purpose was preserving slavery. And here's the thing. Tyler knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't deluded or confused. He was a true believer in states' rights and slavery. He'd spent his entire political career defending the institution. As president, he'd vetoed bills that might have strengthened federal power. He'd pushed for Texas annexation specifically to expand slavery. When push came to shove and the country divided, he chose his section over his nation. So why is John Tyler forgotten? Because his presidency was a constitutional accident that his own party hated, and his post-presidency was treasonous. Because he fathered 15 children, which is less an accomplishment and more a biological feat that nobody asked for. Because his main achievement was annexing Texas, which led to a war and further divided the country over slavery. Because he died draped in the Confederate flag, which pretty much erases whatever else he might have done. He's a historical curiosity, the grandson thing, the accidental presidency, the absurd number of children. But he's not celebrated, and he's not studied much because at the end of the day, he was a states' rights extremist who betrayed his country. And no amount of living grandchildren can make that legacy anything other than shameful. But speaking of people who became president unexpectedly and then surprised everyone, our next guy managed to actually redeem himself. Chester A. Arthur, the machine politician who found out he was dying and decided to actually be a good president. Chester A. Arthur is the poster child for, man, you really can't judge a book by its cover. Except in this case, the book was a well-dressed machine politician everyone assumed would be a corrupt disaster, and the cover turned out to be hiding a terminal illness and an unexpected attack of conscience. He became president after James Garfield was assassinated in 1881, and everyone in Washington thought, well, this is it. The spoils system wins. Corruption forever. Instead, Arthur quietly reformed the civil service, modernized the Navy, and generally tried to be a decent president while dying of kidney disease that he kept secret from almost everyone. Then he burned most of his personal papers so history wouldn't know the full extent of his machine politics past, and now he's so forgotten that most Americans couldn't pick him out of a lineup of bearded Victorian gentlemen. Let's set the scene. Arthur was a product of the New York political machine run by Roscoe Conkling, who we've mentioned before as the guy who hated Rutherford Hayes. Arthur was collector of the New York Custom House, which was one of the most corrupt and lucrative positions in federal service. The Custom House collected tariffs, which meant millions of dollars flowing through, and the collector controlled hundreds of patronage jobs. Arthur used those jobs to reward political supporters and fund the Republican Party machine. He didn't personally steal money, he wasn't that kind of corrupt, but he absolutely used his position to maintain political power. Hayes fired him for it. In 1880, the Republicans needed to balance their ticket. James Garfield was from Ohio and represented the reform wing of the party. The machine bosses wanted their guy as vice president to protect their interests. They picked Arthur. Garfield won. And then 4 months into his presidency, Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau, a deranged office seeker who shouted, "I am a stalwart, Arthur is president now," as he was arrested. Guiteau was not actually connected to Arthur or the stalwarts, the machine wing of the Republican Party, but it sure looked bad. Garfield lingered for 80 days, slowly dying from infections caused by doctors repeatedly sticking their unwashed fingers into his wounds, looking for the bullet. Arthur stayed in New York, afraid that coming to Washington would look like he was eager for Garfield to die. When Garfield finally died on September 19th, 1881, Arthur was at his home in New York, weeping. He took the oath of office at his house at 2:15 in the morning, then again 2 days later in Washington to make it official. And everyone waited for him to reward his machine friends and reverse all the reforms that had been building for years. Instead, Arthur started acting like a completely different person. Here's what almost nobody knew. Chester Arthur had Bright's disease, a kidney condition that was fatal in the 1880s. He'd been diagnosed right around the time he became president, maybe even before. He knew he was dying. He had maybe a few years, and apparently facing your own mortality makes you reconsider your priorities because Arthur decided he was going to try to actually be a good president. His former patron, Roscoe Conkling, came to him expecting favors. Arthur refused. Conkling was furious. He'd made Arthur's career, and now Arthur was shutting him out. But Arthur had decided he didn't want to be remembered as just another machine politician. He supported civil service reform, the exact thing the machine politicians hated most, because it would end the spoils system. In 1883, Arthur signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. It required federal jobs to be awarded based on merit, determined through competitive exams. It created the Civil Service Commission to oversee the process. It prohibited firing federal employees for political reasons. It was everything the political machines had opposed for decades, and Arthur signed it into law. His former friends in the machine politics world felt utterly betrayed. Arthur didn't care. He was dying, and he wanted to leave something better behind. He also started modernizing the Navy. The American Navy in 1881 was a joke. Wooden ships, outdated technology, incapable of competing with European powers. Arthur pushed for steel ships, modern weapons, professionalization of the officer corps. He didn't live to see the results, but the foundation he laid contributed to the new Navy that would make America a world power by the turn of the century. And then there was the White House itself. Arthur hated the White House as he found it. He thought it was shabby and outdated. So he hired Louis Comfort Tiffany, yes, that Tiffany, to completely redecorate. The result was an ornate Victorian wonderland that subsequent presidents would spend decades removing, but at the time it was the height of fashion. Arthur also oversaw the installation of the first elevator in the White House, which, given his deteriorating health, was probably less about luxury and more about necessity. He was known for his fashion sense. He owned 80 pairs of pants. 80. He'd change clothes multiple times a day. He held elaborate dinners with multiple courses and fine wines. He was called Elegant Arthur and the Gentleman Boss. For a guy who was dying, he maintained appearances remarkably well. But he was dying. His energy was limited. He could only work a few hours a day. He'd take long vacations, which the press criticized, not knowing that he was essentially managing a terminal illness. He kept it secret from everyone except a few close friends and his doctor. He didn't want sympathy, and he didn't want his political opponents to know he was weak. In 1884, he wanted the Republican nomination for a full term. He'd earned it, he thought. He'd reformed the civil service, modernized the Navy, been a competent president despite everything. But the party bosses hadn't forgiven him for the civil service reform, and the reformers didn't trust him because of his machine politics past. The party nominated James G. Blaine instead. Arthur accepted the decision without much fight. He was too tired and too sick to battle for it. He left office in March 1885 and returned to New York. He lived for 21 more months, dying on November 18th, 1886, at age 57. And before he died, he burned nearly all his personal papers. He spent days going through documents and feeding them to the fire. His son tried to stop him, but Arthur insisted. He said he was destroying anything that might be incorrectly understood or misunderstood. We'll never know exactly what he burned. Probably correspondence from his machine politics days. Maybe records of deals and compromises that would tarnish his reformed legacy. Maybe personal matters he wanted kept private. Whatever it was, Arthur decided that history didn't need to know everything, and he took those secrets to the grave. He was buried in Albany, New York. His grave is modest. There's a statue of him in Madison Square Park in New York City that almost nobody notices. He's a trivia answer, a footnote, the guy between Garfield and Cleveland in the presidential list. So why is Chester Arthur forgotten? Because he was a machine politician who accidentally became president and then quietly did good things without much fanfare. He didn't have a grand vision or a famous phrase or a dramatic crisis. He just signed some important legislation, modernized the Navy, redecorated the White House, and died. He reformed the spoil system even though he'd benefited from it his entire career, which is genuinely admirable but doesn't make for exciting history. He's the president who knew he was dying and decided to be better than he'd been before. He's proof that people can change, that facing mortality can bring clarity, that doing the right thing sometimes means betraying the people who made your career. And he's forgotten because quiet competence in the face of death doesn't generate legends, but burning your papers ensures that history can't quite figure you out, which in its own way is a kind of immortality, being permanently mysterious, forever just out of reach. And speaking of mysteries and presidents, nobody remembers. Millard Fillmore, the self-taught president, who founded a university, joined the Know-Nothings, and watched his wife die after his inauguration. Millard Fillmore is what happens when someone pulls themselves up by their bootstraps, educates themselves against all odds, becomes president through a series of accidents and deaths, does something historically significant that everyone wishes hadn't happened, and then completely destroys whatever legacy they might have had by joining a xenophobic political party and running a campaign so bad it makes you wonder if they learned anything from being president in the first place. He's the second most forgotten president on this list, which is really saying something given the competition, and his story is a masterclass in how Being in the right place at the right time can get you the most powerful job in the world while being completely unprepared for the moral consequences. Let's start at the beginning because Fillmore's origin story is actually genuinely inspiring before it becomes depressing. He was born in the 1800 in a log cabin in the Finger Lakes region of New York in Cayuga County, in a place so remote that civilization felt like a rumor. And unlike William Henry Harrison's fake log cabin that was really a mansion, this one was authentically, undeniably real. His family was dirt poor in the way that makes modern poverty look comfortable. His father was a tenant farmer who couldn't afford to buy land, who worked someone else's property and hoped to, maybe someday, save enough to own something of his own. That day never came. Young Millard had almost no formal education, a few months here and there in one-room schoolhouses when he wasn't needed on the farm, which was almost never because farms in 1800, whatever required every available hand just to survive. He could barely read. He could barely write. At 14, his father apprenticed him to a clothmaker, essentially indentured servitude, where he'd learn a trade in exchange for room and board and the privilege of not starving. The master was cruel. The work was brutal. Fillmore was trapped. But Fillmore had something that couldn't be taught in any school: determination and an absolute hunger for knowledge that burned in him like a fever. He bought a dictionary, just went out and bought a dictionary with money he'd saved, coin by coin, and he started teaching himself words. He'd read during breaks, read by candlelight at night, read anything he could get his hands on. He walked miles to borrow books from anyone who had them. He attended a small academy in New Hope when he could scrape together the tuition. And there, he met Abigail Powers. Abigail was his teacher. She was 2 years older than him, educated, cultured, everything he wasn't. And she saw something in this rough farm boy who was teaching himself words from a dictionary. She encouraged him. She loaned him books. She believed in him when he had no reason to believe in himself. They fell in love, but they blotted and but he had to make something of himself first. You didn't marry your teacher when you were an apprentice clothmaker with no prospects. Fillmore's father eventually confronted his master and paid to break the apprenticeship contract. Millard was free. He moved to Buffalo, studied law by reading law books and clerking for a judge, passed the bar in 1823, and started a practice. He was good at it. Really good. He made money, he built a reputation, and in 1826, he married Abigail Powers, the teacher who had believed in him when he was nobody. He got into politics through the Anti-Masonic Party, which sounds insane because it was insane. The Anti-Masons were a political party formed around opposition to Freemasons, who were viewed as a secret elite society controlling politics and business and doing mysterious things in lodges. It was conspiracy theory politics in the 1830s, fueled by the disappearance of William Morgan, a Mason who had threatened to reveal the society's secrets and then vanished, probably murdered. The Anti-Masonic Party channeled populist rage at elite secret societies, and Fillmore rode that wave to the New York State Assembly and then to Congress. He served in the House of Representatives from 1833 to 1835, and again from 1837 to 1843. He was competent, hardworking, not particularly inspiring, but reliable. When the Anti-Masonic Party collapsed, he switched to the Whig Party, which was the coalition opposing Andrew Jackson and the Democrats. He became Comptroller of New York, which is a finance position that sounds boring because it absolutely is boring, but it's important and Fillmore was good at it. And then in 1848, the Whigs needed to balance their ticket. They'd nominated Zachary Taylor, a Southern slaveholder and war hero who'd never voted in an election. They needed a Northerner to balance him out, someone who could appeal to Northern voters without alienating the South. They picked Fillmore, the self-made lawyer from Buffalo who'd never said anything controversial enough to offend anyone. Taylor and Fillmore won the election, and almost immediately, they started disagreeing on basically everything that mattered. Taylor opposed the Compromise of 1850, the massive legislative package designed to address the slavery question in the territories gained from the Mexican-American War. Fillmore supported it. Taylor was prepared to personally lead troops against Southern states if they tried to secede and hang the traitors himself. Fillmore wanted to find middle ground, to compromise, to keep everyone in the Union, even if it meant terrible moral compromises. They barely spoke to each other. Cabinet meetings were awkward. The vice president and president were on completely different pages. And then Taylor ate those cherries and died on July 9th, 1850. And suddenly Millard Fillmore was president of the United States at one of the most critical moments in American history. It was like being handed the controls of a plane that was already on fire and in a nosedive. He took the oath of office on July 10th. The entire cabinet resigned the next day. They'd been Taylor's people, loyal to Taylor's vision, and they wanted nothing to do with Fillmore. He had to build a completely new administration while the country was tearing itself apart over slavery, while Southern states were openly threatening secession, while violence was breaking out in the Senate chamber. The Compromise of 1850 was actually 5 separate bills, and they were all terrible in different ways, but taken together they were supposed to save the Union. California would enter as a free state, which was good for the North and infuriated the South. The territories of New Mexico and Utah would use popular sovereignty to decide on slavery, which was just kicking the can down the road and guaranteeing future violence. The slave trade, not slavery itself, just the public buying and selling of human beings, would be abolished in Washington, D.C., which was symbolic but meaningless since slavery itself continued. The border between Texas and New Mexico would be settled with the federal government assuming Texas's debts, which nobody except Texans cared about. And then there was the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was one of the most morally monstrous pieces of legislation in American history. It required federal officials to assist in capturing and returning people accused of being escaped slaves. It required citizens, ordinary people in free states, to assist in capturing escaped slaves if called upon, making them complicit in slavery whether they wanted to be or not. It denied accused runaways the right to a jury trial or even the right to testify in their own defense. It created financial incentives for commissioners to rule in favor of slaveholders. They'd get $10 if they ruled the person was an enslaved person who must be returned, $5 if they ruled the person was free. 10 versus 5. The system was literally designed to encourage ruling in favor of slavery. It essentially nationalized slavery, making every free state complicit in the institution. It meant that black people, even free black people who had been born free in the North, could be kidnapped by slave catchers, dragged before a commissioner, denied the right to defend themselves, and shipped south into slavery based on nothing but someone's claim that they were property. The burden of proof was on the accused to prove they were free, and they couldn't testify or call witnesses. And Millard Fillmore signed it into law in September 1850. He signed it knowing what it would do. He signed it believing it was necessary to save the Union, that the South would secede if the North didn't make this concession, that preserving the United States required this compromise. He was wrong, but he believed it. The North exploded in outrage. Abolitionists were furious. Frederick Douglass condemned it. William Lloyd Garrison burned a copy of the Constitution in protest, calling it a covenant with death. Free black communities in the North were terrified. Thousands fled to Canada rather than risk being kidnapped and enslaved. The Underground Railroad intensified its operations, moving more people to freedom more quickly. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin partly in response to the Fugitive Slave Act, and it became the best-selling novel of the 19th century, turning millions of Northern readers against slavery. Cities like Boston and Milwaukee had riots when federal marshals tried to capture escaped slaves. In Boston, abolitionists stormed a courthouse to try to free Anthony Burns, an escaped slave being held for return to Virginia. They failed, but it took thousands of soldiers and militia to escort Burns to the ship that would take him back to slavery, and it cost the federal government more than $100,000 to return one man to bondage. In Wisconsin, Sherman Booth was arrested for helping Joshua Glover, an escaped slave, escape from federal custody. The Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled the Fugitive Slave Act unconstitutional, leading to a showdown with federal authority, and Fillmore sent in federal troops to enforce the law. He believed in the rule of law, believed that once Congress passed something and the president signed it, it must be enforced even if it was unjust. He was a lawyer, trained to think in terms of legal process and constitutional authority. The idea that a law could be so immoral that it should be resisted didn't seem to occur to him, or if it did, he suppressed it in favor of preserving the Union. His personal life during this period was quietly falling apart. His daughter Mary, born in 1832, died in 1854 at age 22 from cholera. His wife Abigail, who had been his teacher and inspiration and partner for nearly 30 years, had been ill for a while with what was probably tuberculosis or a similar respiratory illness. She was frail, she was in pain, but she insisted on attending the inauguration of Fillmore's successor, Franklin Pierce, in March 1853. It was a cold, wet day. She stood on the Capitol steps for hours in the freezing wind, watching Pierce take the oath of office, watching her husband officially stop being president. She caught a cold. The cold became pneumonia. Within weeks, she was bedridden. On March 30th, 1853, less than a month after Fillmore left office, Abigail Powers Fillmore died. Fillmore was devastated. He'd lost the woman who'd educated him, believed in him, loved him when he was nobody. He mourned for a year. He wore black. He withdrew from public life. And then, apparently, he decided the best way to honor her memory was to get back into politics in the worst way possible. In 1856, Fillmore joined the Know Nothing Party, officially called the American Party, a nativist, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic political movement that blamed Irish and German immigrants for everything wrong with America. The Know Nothings wanted to ban foreign-born citizens from holding office, require 21 years of residency before naturalization, and generally make life as difficult as possible for anyone who wasn't a native-born Protestant. They were called Know Nothings because they started as a secret society, and when asked about their activities, members would say, "I know nothing." They were basically a 19th century version of white nationalist politics, and Millard Fillmore, former president, self-educated man who'd pulled himself up from poverty, joined them. Why? Historians still debate this. Maybe he genuinely believed immigration was threatening American identity. Maybe he was desperate for political relevance after being rejected by the Whigs. Maybe he thought the Know Nothings were the only party that could bridge the North-South divide and prevent civil war, and he was willing to overlook their bigotry for that goal. Maybe he was just lonely and broken after Abigail's death and made a terrible decision. Whatever his reasoning, he accepted their presidential nomination in 1856 and campaigned on their platform. He lost, badly. He won only one state, Maryland, and got 21% of the popular vote. James Buchanan won the presidency, and we already know how that turned out. The Know Nothing Party collapsed shortly after, unable to survive the slavery crisis that was tearing the country apart. Fillmore's political career was over, his reputation destroyed, The man who'd once been president was now permanently associated with one of the most nakedly bigoted political movements of the 19th century. But here's something genuinely good that Fillmore did, something that deserves to be remembered even though it usually isn't. He founded the University of Buffalo. Well, founded is a strong word. He was the first chancellor and helped establish it in 1846 while he was comptroller of New York. It started as a private medical college, just one building and a handful of students. Fillmore remained involved throughout his life, raising money, attracting faculty, helping it grow. Today, it's the State University of New York at Buffalo, a major public research university with thousands of students. That's a real lasting contribution to education and society, something that's helped tens of thousands of people get educated and build better lives. He also installed the first permanent bathtub in the White House, which sounds trivial but represented modernization of the executive mansion. He established the White House Library, collecting books for future presidents to use. He sent Commodore Matthew Perry to open trade with Japan, which had been isolated for centuries. That expedition laid the groundwork for modern US-Japan relations. These aren't nothing. They're just overshadowed by the Fugitive Slave Act and the Know-Nothings. After his failed presidential run, Fillmore remarried in 1858 to Caroline McIntosh, a wealthy widow. They lived comfortably in Buffalo. He did charity work, served on boards, helped found organizations. When the Civil War started in 1861, he supported the Union but criticized Lincoln's methods: suspension of habeas corpus, the Emancipation Proclamation, the use of black soldiers. He thought Lincoln was going too far, moving too fast. By this point, criticizing Lincoln was his brand, supporting the right side while complaining about the methods. He lived until March 8th, 1874, dying of a stroke at age 74, after suffering a series of smaller strokes in the preceding weeks. His last words were supposedly, "The nourishment is palatable," referring to his last meal, which is perhaps the most Millard Fillmore way to die imaginable: polite, unremarkable, forgettable. He was buried in Buffalo's Forest Lawn Cemetery next to Abigail. There's a statue of him in Buffalo City Hall. The University of Buffalo has buildings named after him. But nationally, he's forgotten, and for good reason. Millard Fillmore is forgotten because he signed the Fugitive Slave Act, which helped push the country towards civil war while pretending to prevent it. He's forgotten because he joined a bigoted, nativist party when he should have known better, when his own life story of rising from poverty through education and opportunity should have made him sympathetic to immigrants seeking the same. He's forgotten because his presidency was defined by a compromise that satisfied no one and solved nothing, that delayed civil war by a decade while making it more inevitable and more bloody. He is proof that being self-taught and ambitious doesn't make you wise, that good intentions can lead to terrible outcomes, that you can overcome poverty and educate yourself and achieve the highest office in the land and still make catastrophic moral choices. The bathtub and the university and the Japan expedition are footnotes. The Fugitive Slave Act and the Know-Nothings are the story, and they're a story everyone would rather forget. And now we arrive at our final president, the most forgotten of all, the one whose story is so saturated with tragedy and failure that even remembering him feels cruel. Franklin Pierce, the alcoholic president, who memorized 3,000 words, killed a woman with his horse, and watched his son die 2 months before inauguration. Franklin Pierce is the most forgotten president in American history. And if you know anything about his life, you'll understand why forgetting him is not just easy, but actually an act of mercy for everyone involved. This is a man who watched his 11-year-old son's head get crushed in a train accident 2 months before becoming president, who took office so shattered by grief that he couldn't function, whose wife spent 2 years writing letters to their dead child instead of being first lady, who proceeded to lead the country so catastrophically that he made the Civil War more likely and more bloody, who alienated his own party so thoroughly that they refused to renominate him, and who spent his final years drinking himself to death while his former friends crossed the street to avoid him. If Millard Fillmore's presidency was a failure, Pierce's was a slow motion catastrophe played out in front of the entire nation. But let's start before everything fell apart, because Franklin Pierce's early life suggested someone who'd be perfectly competent at managing things without ever being particularly memorable. He was born on November 23rd, 1804, in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. His father, Benjamin Pierce, was a Revolutionary War veteran who'd fought at Bunker Hill and later became governor of New Hampshire. The family had status, connections, enough money to send Franklin to good schools. He wasn't born into poverty like Fillmore. He had advantages. He went to Bowdoin College in Maine, where he was apparently quite popular but a mediocre student. He partied, he socialized, he did the minimum work necessary. By his own later admission, he was near the bottom of his class after his sophomore year. But something changed. Maybe pride, maybe ambition, maybe fear of disappointing his father, and he buckled down. He studied, he worked, he graduated in 1824, fifth in his class. Not bad for someone who'd been failing 2 years earlier. He became a lawyer practicing in Hillsborough and Concord. He was good at it, articulate, persuasive, with a voice that carried and a presence that commanded attention. People liked him. He had that quality some politicians have where people just naturally trust them, want to be around them, believe what they say, even if they're not saying anything particularly substantive. He got into politics young. He was elected to the New Hampshire legislature at age 24, became speaker at 28. He was elected to Congress in 1833 at age 28, to the Senate in 1837 at age 32. He was charming, handsome in that dark-haired, intense way that suggested depth even when there wasn't much there. He was ambitious, clearly headed for bigger things, but his personal life was complicated. In 1834, he married Jane Means Appleton, the daughter of a Bowdoin College president, and by all accounts it was not a happy marriage. Jane was deeply religious, emotionally fragile, prone to depression and illness. She hated politics, hated Washington, hated the social obligations that came with being a politician's wife. She wanted Pierce to quit, to come home to New Hampshire, to live a quiet life. He'd promised to quit, then get drawn back in. The pattern repeated for years. They had 3 sons. Franklin Jr., born in 1839, died after 3 days. Frank Robert, born in 1839, died in 1843 at age 4 from typhus. Benjamin, born in 1841, survived. He became the center of Jane's entire world, the one child who'd lived, the one she poured all her love and fear and desperate need to protect into. Pierce left the Senate in 1842, partly to save his marriage, partly because Jane's health was genuinely declining. She probably had tuberculosis or something similar. He went back to New Hampshire, practiced law, seemed to be settling into a quiet life. And then the Mexican-American War happened in 1846, and Pierce, unable to resist the call of glory and public service, volunteered. He became a brigadier general and served under Winfield Scott. His combat record was genuinely embarrassing. During the march to Mexico City, his horse reared in panic, and Pierce was thrown against the pommel of his saddle, severely injuring his groin. He passed out from the pain. The next day, during the Battle of Contreras, he fainted again, possibly from the injury, possibly from heat, possibly from dysentery, which was ravaging the army. His political opponents would later call him the fainting general and mock his military service, which was unfair but also based on actual events. After the war, he returned to New Hampshire and practiced law. He stayed out of national politics, He was known as a doughface, a northern man with southern sympathies on slavery. He believed slavery was constitutionally protected, that the federal government had no authority to interfere with it in states where it existed, that abolitionists were dangerous radicals threatening the Union. This made him acceptable to Southern Democrats, which would prove crucial in 1852. The Democratic National Convention of 1852 in Baltimore was deadlocked. The leading candidates, Lewis Cass, James Buchanan, Stephen Douglas, William Marcy, couldn't get the two-thirds majority needed for nomination. Ballot after ballot, no one could win. And then, on the 35th ballot, someone suggested Franklin Pierce as a compromise candidate. He was from the North, but friendly to the South. He was a veteran. He was handsome, charming, eloquent. He'd been out of national politics long enough to not have many enemies or controversial positions on record. He was acceptable to everyone precisely because he'd offended no one. On the 49th ballot, the Democrats nominated Franklin Pierce, a dark horse candidate who hadn't even been seriously considered a week earlier. The Whigs nominated Winfield Scott, Pierce's former commanding officer from Mexico. It should have been competitive, but the Whigs were splitting apart over slavery. Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs could barely agree on anything. Pierce won in a landslide, carrying 27 of 31 states. It should have been a moment of triumph, the culmination of a political career that had started when he was 24. Instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare that would destroy him, his wife, and any chance he had of being even a mediocre president. On January 6th, 1853, 2 months before the inauguration, Franklin and Jane Pierce were traveling by train from Boston to Concord, New Hampshire, with their 11-year-old son, Benjamin. They'd been in Boston visiting family. The train was heading home. Everything was normal, routine, unremarkable. And then the axle broke. The car they were in rolled down an embankment. Metal screamed, wood splintered. The world became chaos and noise and terror. When it stopped, Franklin and Jane were alive, bruised and shaken, but alive. They looked for Benjamin. He was dead. His head had been crushed, nearly decapitated, right there in front of them. Their last surviving child, the one they'd protected and worried over and loved desperately, was gone in an instant. 11 years old. Jane Pierce never recovered. Never. She believed, and she told Franklin this repeatedly, that God had killed Benjamin to remove distractions so Franklin could focus on being president, that their son's death was divine punishment for Franklin's ambition. She spent the first 2 years of the presidency in the private quarters of the White House, rarely appearing in public, writing letters to Benjamin's spirit, existing in a state of grief so profound that she was barely functional. When she did appear at public functions, she wore black, moved like a ghost, and looked like she wanted to die. Franklin Pierce took the oath of office on March 4th, 1853, in front of a crowd of thousands, and he didn't put his hand on a Bible. He placed his hand on a law book and affirmed, rather than swore the oath. Some historians think this was because of his grief. He didn't feel worthy to swear on a Bible after his son's death. Others think it was a principled stance about religious freedom and the separation of church and state. Whatever the reason, it was unusual enough that people noticed and commented. And then he did something truly remarkable. He delivered his entire inaugural address from memory. No notes, no script, no teleprompter, obviously, because it was 1853. 3,319 words, delivered flawlessly without reference to any text. It remains the only inaugural address before or since given entirely from memory. He'd spent weeks memorizing it, every sentence, every clause, every subordinate phrase. It should have been impressive. It should have demonstrated intellectual capacity and dedication. Instead, the content of the speech revealed a man who fundamentally misunderstood or deliberately ignored the crisis facing the country. He spoke about expansion, about American destiny, about how the policy of my administration will not be controlled by any timid forebodings of evil from expansion. He signaled that he'd support adding more territory to the United States, including Cuba, which would come in as slave territory. He told the South he'd protect their constitutional rights, meaning slavery, and told the North to stop agitating about it because it was hurting the Union. His administration immediately began making everything worse. His cabinet was stacked with pro-slavery Southerners and Northern doughfaces. His Secretary of War was Jefferson Davis, future President of the Confederacy, who would use his position to strengthen Southern military capabilities and place federal arms in Southern arsenals where they'd be available when secession came. His Secretary of State was William Marcy, who presided over the Austin Manifesto disaster. And then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which might be the single most catastrophic piece of legislation in American history short of the Fugitive Slave Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, introduced in January 1854 by Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, but strongly supported and pushed by President Pierce, repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The Missouri Compromise had prohibited slavery north of the 3630 line, the southern border of Missouri extending west. It had held for 34 years, maintaining a fragile balance. The Kansas-Nebraska Act destroyed it. The act created two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and allowed them to decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty, meaning the settlers would vote on whether to allow slavery. This meant Kansas, which was north of the line where slavery had been banned for more than 3 decades, could now become a slave state if enough pro-slavery settlers moved there. So that's exactly what happened. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri, called border ruffians, poured into Kansas. They came armed, ready to fight, determined to make Kansas a slave state. Anti-slavery settlers from New England and the North did the same, funded by organizations like the New England Emigrant Aid Company. Both sides were armed. Both sides were willing to use violence. Both sides believed they were fighting for the soul of the nation. The result was bleeding Kansas, years of guerrilla warfare, massacres, assassinations, and political violence that made the territory essentially ungovernable. John Brown became famous during this period, leading anti-slavery forces in brutal retaliatory attacks. The Pottawatomie Massacre in May 1856, where Brown and his followers killed 5 pro-slavery settlers by hacking them to death with broadswords, was a direct response to the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas, where pro-slavery forces had destroyed the town's anti-slavery newspapers and hotels. The violence in Kansas became a preview of the Civil War, a rehearsal for the bloodshed that would consume the nation, and Franklin Pierce's response was to side with the pro-slavery territorial government, even though that government had been elected through massive fraud. Thousands of Missourians crossed into Kansas just to vote and then went home. He called the anti-slavery settlers the agitators and troublemakers. He threatened to use federal troops against them. He made everything worse, and through all this, Pierce was drinking. He'd always drunk socially, most politicians did in the 19th century. But after Benjamin's death, after watching Jane retreat into grief and madness, after the constant political failures and the Kansas violence and the realization that his presidency was a disaster, he drank more. There are accounts of him being noticeably drunk at official functions. His friends worried. His enemies mocked him as a drunk. Historians still debate the extent of his alcoholism. Some say it's exaggerated by his opponents. Others say it was severe and debilitating. What's clear is that he was self-medicating for grief and depression in an era before anyone understood mental health or addiction as medical conditions. He was trying to numb the pain of losing his son, of watching his wife suffer, of knowing his presidency was failing. The Democrats didn't nominate him for re-election in 1856. He wanted it, He genuinely thought he could win a second term and vindicate his first. Instead, the party rejected him at the convention, making him one of the few elected presidents denied his own party's renomination. They nominated James Buchanan instead, which tells you how catastrophically bad Pierce's presidency was when James Buchanan seemed like an improvement. Pierce left office in March 1857 and returned to New Hampshire, a broken man. Jane lived another 6 years, dying in December 1863, her health destroyed by grief and depression. Pierce lived 4 more years after that, drinking heavily, increasingly isolated from old friends who had moved on or died or simply couldn't bear to be around him anymore. When the Civil War started in 1861, Pierce opposed Lincoln's policies. He thought the war was unnecessary, that compromise was still possible, that Lincoln was a tyrant for suspending habeas corpus and violating states' rights. This made him deeply unpopular in the North. When Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, Pierce's house in Concord was attacked by an angry mob who thought he wasn't displaying enough grief. He had to come out and explain that he'd lowered his flag to half-mast, but they'd missed it because of the angle of the house. He died on October 8th, 1869, of cirrhosis of the liver. He was 64. His last words were reportedly, "There's nothing left to do but keep still." He was buried in Concord's Old North Cemetery next to Jane and Benjamin. For decades, there was no monument on his grave, just a simple stone. The state of New Hampshire eventually erected a marker, but it took more than a century. Oh, and there's one more thing, one more bizarre detail that somehow fits perfectly into Franklin Pierce's chaotic, tragic story. In 1853, shortly before he became president, Pierce was riding his horse through Washington, D.C., when he struck a woman named Mrs. Nathan Lewis, who was crossing the street. She was seriously injured. Pierce was arrested and charged. The case went to court. The charges were eventually dropped, possibly because he was president-elect, definitely because legal standards for such accidents were very different in 1853. But Franklin Pierce remains one of the very few presidents to have been arrested, and he managed to do it by running someone over with his horse. Franklin Pierce is forgotten because his presidency was an absolute disaster, because his personal life was saturated with tragedy, and because everyone involved, his family, his party, his country, just wanted to move on and pretend it hadn't happened. He's called the president with hands like an iceberg. When you met him, his hands were supposedly cold as ice, possibly from poor circulation related to alcoholism, possibly from the metaphorical coldness of a man who'd lost everything he loved and couldn't feel warmth anymore. He memorized 3,000 words but couldn't lead. He freed Kansas to choose slavery and created a war zone. He watched his son die, watched his wife withdraw into madness, watched his country fracture, and he couldn't stop any of it. He tried, he failed, he drank, he died. And history, in perhaps its only kindness to Franklin Pierce, mostly forgot he existed at all. He's the most forgotten president because forgetting him is easier than confronting the depth of his failure and sorrow. Easier than acknowledging how completely a person can be broken by tragedy and still be expected to lead. Easier than admitting that sometimes the presidency destroys the person who holds it. He's what happens when personal catastrophe and political weakness and historical crisis intersect with someone who's simply not equipped to handle any of it. And that brings us to the end of our journey through America's most forgotten presidents, 10 men who led the country through accidents, tragedy, compromise, and spectacular failure, and who've been mostly erased from collective memory as a reward for their service. We've met the male model who pardoned Nixon, the general who died from fruit, the guy who invented OK and lost to a fake log cabin, the bachelor who watched the Union collapse, the poker player who died before his scandals broke, The president who banned alcohol and answered the first White House telephone, the accidental leader whose grandson is still alive, the machine politician who reformed the system while dying in secret, the self taught man who joined the Know Nothings, and the broken father who memorized 3,000 words while his world fell apart. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be grateful you're not responsible for holding a fragmenting nation together while your wife writes letters to your dead child, or signing legislation that makes civil war inevitable, or losing government property in card games. The presidency breaks some people. History forgets most of them. Sleep well, and remember, sometimes being forgotten is the kindest thing that can happen. Sweet dreams.